In lesson number 2 here, we're going to have a look at how we deploy the vCenter appliance. At the end of this lesson, we'll watch a little bit of a demonstration on this as well. Now, in our lab environment, we're not going to have you deploy the appliance just for time's sake, okay? But you'll see that it's not a difficult thing to do. So why don't we go ahead and dive in? We'll have at it here. We'll deploy the vCenter appliance into our vSphere infrastructure, and we'll configure some of the initial settings for vCenter Server itself. So the first thing that we need to know is that this is a virtual machine. This virtual machine is going to have a static IP address and a fully qualified domain name. So what you should do before you even start is figure out what that static IP address is going to be and what its fully qualified host name should be, and you're going to add that to DNS. Okay? You're going to put it in both forward and reverse lookup zones, and you're going to make sure that the clocks in this particular virtual machine and your virtual machines that are already running in the environment, if you have any VMs up and running in this environment yet, okay, and your ESXi hosts themselves are all synchronized through NTP protocols. As a part of the wizard of deploying vCenter Server, it'll ask you to point to NTP servers. So we're going to go ahead and do that and be aware of that. So there's a graphical installer that is included with vCenter Server. So here's what happens. You go to VMware's website and you download an ISO image. It's actually pretty big. It's several gigabytes. Once we download this installer, we're going to mount it to some sort of system that's in front of us. It could be a laptop, you could mount it to another virtual machine, it can be Windows, it can be Linux, it can be a Mac OS. This is just for the installation process. In the end, we know that vCenter is not a Windows application, it's a Linux application that is going to get deployed straight to an ESXi host. So you also need to know the IP address or the fully qualified domain name of the host to which it's going to be deployed. So I'll mount this ISO image. In this particular case, you can see that we're running in that we're launching this from a Windows system. So I'll right-click on the ISO image and I'll say Open with Explorer. And that'll mount it. It creates a drive letter for a virtual CD or DVD drive. And you'll see under there's a directory called VCSA-UI installer. VCSA stands for vCenter Server Appliance. So there's a UI installer. There also happens to be a command line based installer as well. In the UI installer directory, there are separate folders for Linux, Mac, and Windows. So in this case, we'll go to the Windows one, and you will see that there's an install.exe that we're going to run. Once we launch the installer, this is the screen that you see. There are 4 different options here. We can install a brand new vCenter. We can upgrade an existing vCenter. We can migrate from an old Windows vCenter to the new appliance, or we can restore our vCenter from a backup. With any of these processes, it's done in a 2-stage installation. The first stage will deploy the virtual machine, and the second stage will configure that virtual machine. So in stage 1, you can see there are 8 steps, okay? And these steps are relatively simple and straightforward. In step 1, we'll accept the end user license agreement, okay? Well, sorry, step 1 is the introduction. It says, okay, this is going to be a 2-stage process. Step 2 says accept the end user license agreement. Step 3 says that we are going to point to an ESXi host. Okay, so we're going to install vCenter on an ESXi host. We can actually have vCenter be managed by another vCenter if you want. You can have a vCenter managing lots of vCenters if that's something that you want to do. So you can point to either ESXi or an existing vCenter server if you want as well. Then we're going to define the vCenter appliance's name, its fully qualified domain name, its host name, as well as a password for the root account for the virtual machine itself. Okay. Then I'm going to select the size of the VM. Okay. Do I want it, how much CPU and how much memory? how big will the disks be, and where will the data store be, right? On what data store will this virtual machine be deployed? We're also going to have some networking settings. What's its IP address going to be, subnet mask, on what virtual network will it be deployed upon, and all of these kinds of things. We saw that when we did the initial installation of ESXi itself, it created a default virtual machine port group. So there will be options there for you to place this. So that's stage one, where the appliance is deployed to an ESXi host, the disks, the networking are configured, and vCenter itself is then powered on. In stage two, there's some configuration that we're going to do. We're going to configure time, we're going to configure NTP, we are going to configure our single sign-on server. Do we want to build a new single sign-on domain? Now this is separate from Active Directory. Every vCenter server has a single sign-on domain where you can either create it, or in order to do enhanced linked mode, you'll join an existing single sign-on domain by pointing that new vCenter to an existing vCenter. Okay? In this case, we're joining an existing domain. Okay? We'll point it to the existing vCenter. We'll give it a username and password, and we'll choose whether or not to join the Customer Experience Improvement Program. Now, the Customer Experience Improvement Program is really important for a number of things. It sends some telemetry out to VMware, but it's also used to retrieve information from VMware, things like the hardware compatibility list, so we can use that Skyline system to make sure that all of the components that we have in our environment are compatible with vSphere 7, for example. Once the vCenter application has been deployed, the appliance is up and running, and it's started, and all the services are started, all I have to do is point a browser to this new fully qualified domain name with a /UI at the end of it. Okay? I'm going to log in with a user account called administrator@vsphere.local. I will have set the password during the installer, and now I have full rights over vCenter, which will really have nothing going on yet, okay? Because this is a brand new vCenter. Once this is done, I can log in. I can now go to my vCenter server. I'll click on it. I'll click the configure button, and there are a few things that I can configure itself, okay? Some things under general where I can see the statistics and the database and a few runtime settings, and I can set up a mail server and an SNP receivers so that I can actually send notification emails from vCenter if alarms or alerts have been configured, and so on. Okay. You'll also see licensing for vCenter. You can set up a message of the day. You can manage all of your advanced settings. There's an authentication proxy in case I am network booting my ESXi hosts and I want them to be Active Directory domain members. I can configure and store all of the domain information in vCenter for all of my network booted or Pixie booted ESXi hosts. And then I have vCenter HA, which we're going to discuss later on in this particular module. Okay? So that's the initial configuration of vCenter. Now that runs on port 443 and is accessed by pointing a browser to the fully qualified domain name of your vCenter with the /UI at the end. Now, there is a separate interface for managing the virtual machine itself. This is called the vCenter Server Appliance Management Interface, or VAMI. And this runs on port 5480. So you'll notice here that we're pointing to our vCenter not with /UI, but with a :5480. In this case, I need to log in using an account that is local to my vCenter server. So for example, I'll log in as root here. And here's where I can do things like monitor the resource usage of the appliance. I can back up the appliance. I can monitor the services that are running on vCenter. I can add an additional network adapter to my vCenter so that if I wanted to, I could multi-home vCenter server itself as well. Doing multi-homing is a pretty simple thing to do. If you head over here to networking, and I apologize for the little bit of a layout issue here on the slide here, but the picture says 1,000 words. On the VAMI interface on port 5480, I go to networking, and I'm going to see my first virtual NIC. Okay, so what this does, that's going to be up here. It'll show me my host name and the whole bit. Okay, and if I wanted to add another network adapter, I can just edit the settings of the virtual machine and add more network adapters, where I can point to a fully qualified, I can assign it an IP address on whatever network I want. Okay, so I can add, I think, up to two extra networks to my vCenter. So when we come back, we're going to have a demonstration of the entire process of installing my vCenter appliance. I hope you enjoy that, and after that, we'll continue our lesson. Thanks.